Welcome to the latest episode of Hello CISO. And today we're going to be talking about shadow IT and working from home. Now, shadow IT is the IT that's used in the business that slips under the IT radar. This is the business solving business problems without the involvement of the technology department. I'm excited to talk about shadow IT today because it has become hugely relevant, particularly in this era with so many people working from home and outside the corporate boundaries. Now, I have a long history with shadow IT because I remember being the person in IT who'd have to try and support the business after someone went out and stood up an Access database to solve their business problem. That worked fine for them. And then it became a business critical solution that many people depended on, but it didn't scale. So they looked to the IT department. And this was a perfect example of shadow IT. Now, shadow is a perfectly relevant word in this context because shadow IT does lead to blind spots within the organization, bits of technology where problems have been solved by the business, but they are out of sight of the technology specialists. But paradoxically, as the IT department, if you're willing to give up a little bit of control, you can often gain a lot more control. Let's go and start to dig into that further. Shadow IT is a term that sounds scary to many IT managers. They're used to having control, visibility. They know what are the machines in the environment, what are the applications that are being used, how do people use them within the business. So when we talk about shadow IT and things happening out of sight, it's perfectly understandable that this is concerning to many IT managers. Further to that, when we talk about shadow IT in a physical organization, so where people do actually come into the office, there is some degree of visibility. You can walk past people's desks and see what they're doing. Further to that, people who are in the office are conscious that people, such as myself back in the day, walking past someone's desk would be able to see what they're doing. But not so much once we're at home, not in the modern era, where so many of us don't have a choice but to work from home. Shadow IT is suddenly no longer as physically visible at what it was only a very short time ago. Now, of course, none of this is to say that shadow IT didn't happen before people worked from home, because it did. It's just that now it is that much more under the radar. And of course, keep in mind, shadow IT by definition was under the radar to begin with. It's just even further down now. One of the things that has exacerbated the rate of shadow IT is the cloud. Now, I love the cloud. The cloud has done wonderful things, but by its very nature, the cloud is so easily accessible and so cost effective that not only does it help us solve legitimate business problems in mainstream IT, but it also helps the shadow IT in other parts of the business solve their own problems without the engagement of the IT department. This is something that we've been dealing with for many years on premise, but of course now with so many people remote, it's an even bigger problem. And it's a problem that people can more readily solve from the privacy of their own home than when they were physically in the office and observable by other people. The challenge then is, how do we solve this? So very often as IT departments, we try and solve this with the technology. Let's put controls on the things people can do. Let's control the network. But that's a harder problem when people are at home and they're on their own network. As an IT organization, we might have been able to control things like the nature of the websites people could visit. You can do that when you control the corporate gateway. You can't do that when someone's connecting out through their own gateway at home, through their own local ISP. So that's just one example of where it becomes harder to control shadow IT with people remote than when they were back in the office. In many ways, we've also had this problem for years with things like BYOD. Now, we've had the premise of bringing your own device for well over a decade now. And this was a situation where people did have their own physical devices, but the organisation wanted to impose some sort of controls or rules over it. So we got into this realm of device management, and that works to an extent. But that, again, becomes a harder problem when the devices people have are actually their entire home network. That is the thing that people are now bringing to, air quotes, the office. One way organisations deal with this is to use VPNs. So for people working with corporate equipment, connecting from that equipment into the private network of the organisation via a virtual private network, at least digitally puts people within the corporate boundaries. But really, all we've done is put people back in the office in a virtual sense, which is where we still had shadow IT problems before. Plus, people do normally have an internet connection before they then establish a VPN connection. So the presence or the availability of a VPN alone really isn't sufficient. It doesn't solve the whole problem. What a VPN does do is opens back up those official, sanctioned, internally accessible applications to a remote workforce. And that is something that does make a lot of sense in the current era. A VPN is not something to rush into. You want to be clear about what is the value proposition of pushing one out to a workforce. You also want to be cautious not to create fear. Frightened people do tend to make poor decisions. But there is a role for the VPN to play, and there is a role for it to play in conjunction with the access that people might have directly to the likes of cloud services. VPNs are not a silver bullet. And speaking of silver bullets, let's talk about SSO, or single sign-on. The ability to authenticate once to one service and then access all of the other things you need to, as opposed to having multiple accounts in multiple places. Now, without doubt, SSO has a fantastic role to play. Consolidation of things like secrets is very valuable within an organization, from both a security perspective and a usability perspective. I would much rather go into the organization and log on once, particularly into a highly secure SSO environment, and then have access to all the things I need to, rather than having to maintain all those separate accounts. A recent 1Password study of IT professionals found that for every organization that uses an enterprise password manager, there are two other ones that don't, because they see SSO or password resets as a sufficient alternative. Now, one of the very simple reasons why that position doesn't make sense is shadow IT. So remember, shadow IT is where IT is delivered outside of the formal constructs of an IT department. Now, that formal construct would normally include something like SSO. But when you get people going out there and solving their business problems themselves, especially when they're going out there standing up their own cloud services, do you think they're using SSO? Or are they creating new accounts for people in new places? It's the latter, of course. When parts of the business solve their business problems themselves, when they create shadow IT without the involvement of the formal IT department, they're not going to be doing it in an SSO-friendly model. But we also need to be cautious as the IT department that we don't stifle innovation and the progression of the business by demanding that everything goes through the same model. There are many wonderful services out there that are simply not going to play nice with an organization's SSO implementation. Should the business be denied access to those? Or will they go and do it anyway and then create shadow IT? They're going to do it anyway, inevitably. This is why we have the problem of shadow IT in the first place. So if it was me back in my IT position in a corporate role, I would be looking to work with the business and understand that ultimately a more augmented hybrid model of SSO and standalone accounts is the one that makes the most sense. This is an important revelation, it's an important mindset for IT departments to take. And by recognizing that there is a role to play by systems that don't necessarily integrate into an SSO model, we also now recognize that people will have multiple accounts. They'll have multiple passwords. They'll be with separate external services that may not come directly under the purview of the IT department. And that's a very, very important acknowledgement to make. There are those amongst us who think that there is a simple answer to this. Ban shadow IT. No more shadow IT. Not allowed. Thou shalt not use devices or services that aren't provisioned by the IT department and officially sanctioned. Good luck with that. The chances of that actually working and moving the organization forward, not just in a more secure fashion, but in a more productive fashion as well, are very, very slim. We need to think differently about shadow IT. We need to think differently about how the IT department becomes an enabler for the business. And the business works with the IT department to implement solutions that everyone is aware of. But they may not necessarily all adhere to what our perfect view would be of an enterprise-grade system. So let's talk about how we can approach this differently. How can we think differently about shadow IT? If you've enjoyed this video as part of the Hello CISO series, then please give it a like and subscribe to the 1Password YouTube channel for more videos like this.